Good afternoon everybody, it's Debbie Evans and a wriggly Rolo here, and today we're delving into book 3 in the Secret Adventures of Rolo series. This one's called The Dragon's Pram, and this is about Rolo's second encounter with King John. So I'm just going to launch straight in. Rolo's fixated on the little bribes I'm giving him. Right, settle down. So, Rolo and Magna Carta. "Do you remember King John?" said Athelstan. How could I forget the grumpy English king who, when he came to grant the people of Marlborough a royal charter back in 1204, had ignored my request for a permanent doggy bowl in the High Street. Although, to be fair, he did take on board my suggestion of a twice-weekly market in the town. I put my head on one side to show I was listening and dropped the pink ball. "We need your tactful negotiating skills again," said Athelstan. "You'll see why when you get there. Good luck, off you go." And with that, I found myself staring at the oak tree with the time tunnel yawning ahead of me and Yulia and Dar impatiently waving their lanterns in the entrance. Yulia explained that after our last meeting in the 13th century, King John had gone around the country appeasing his subjects by dishing out royal charters in return for support from his people. However, his goodwill was short-lived, and he had once again overstepped the mark by forcing extremely heavy taxation on the barons called scutage, and the money raised by this taxation he used to pay mercenaries to go and fight his battles. It seemed the English barons were not too keen to embark on costly campaigns abroad, as they rarely had their expenses reimbursed by the king. King John had also introduced something called amercement, which was a hefty fine on people for neglect of public duty. This law was a bit vague. If you offended against the king's peace, you could be fined for pretty much doing or not doing anything. The ruling was deliberately woolly and could not be argued against, so the barons were getting pretty annoyed. It seemed King John had not learned his lessons from their last confrontation. He was corrupting the justice system to blackmail his barons and gain money for the crown. King John was not going to win any popularity contest in 1215. The time tunnel led me to the centre of a big yew tree with a hole in its trunk. We were in a place called Ankerwick in the grounds of a small priory. Well, I certainly wouldn't forget where the entrance was this time. I glanced back into the tree. Yulia and Dar had already disappeared with their lanterns into the safety of the tunnel. A lady wearing a tall pointy hat draped with a veil glided towards me. I say glided because she moved so serenely it seemed that she was on wheels. She bent down to pat me, and I imagined her voice to be soft and gentle and tinkling like a tiny bell. I asked her where King John could be found, and her lovely face darkened a little. She didn't seem to be surprised to be spoken to by a dog. She wouldn't speak to me, however, but pointed through the woodland to a gate on the other side of the priory gardens. I pricked up an ear and heard the very distant but unmistakable sound of angry men. That rumble of discontent was in deep contrast to the peace and tranquillity within the grounds of the priory, but there was nothing else for it. I was on a mission and ran off in the direction of the noise. It seemed I had arrived at a makeshift royal court. Looking about, I spied a large fancy tent, the source of the commotion. All manner of people were raising their voices, trying to make their demands heard. The sound under the awning was deafening. I followed the general direction of their anger and recognised at once the unmistakable figure of King John, a surly man with unkempt black hair, scowling as he slumped in an ornamental seat. His crown was wedged down on his head, trying to tame his locks. I thought it best to keep out of his way and hid under the table, just out of range of his outstretched legs, trying hard to make sense of what was going on. A familiar voice cleared the tent. It was the scribe whom I'd encountered during a previous time-travelling adventure. He must have been promoted since our last meeting. The man had grown in stature and his voice carried authority, but he sounded rather weary as he entreated the barons to go and take lunch and promised that they would reconvene their discussions in the afternoon. I'm sure I was the only one to notice from beneath the table that he had his fingers crossed behind his back. The king stood up in a rage, knocked his chair over, flinging the golden crown across the table. He stormed off in the opposite direction of the disgruntled barons. The scribe righted the chair with a sigh and placed the crown on the table next to the document. I poked my head out from under the table covering. "Oh, it's you again. Got any bright ideas about how to get the barons off the king's back this time, have you, Scruffy?" The scribe bent down and roughly stroked my ears. I imagined that it had been a difficult morning. I submitted to his ruffling and then asked if I could see what had been agreed already. I climbed upon the great ornamental chair, still warm from the royal posterior, and put my paws on the table, making an important stance, pretending for a moment that I was king. The scribe put the crown on my head, but it was a bit big and slipped over one ear. The hapless scribe pushed the document towards me, jabbing his finger at the relevant bits. He explained that if they did not reach some sort of agreement that day, then the whole of England would fall into the hands of the French. The barons, fed up with broken promises, had already started negotiating with the French crown prince, and the prospect of England being ruled by the French was becoming more and more likely. I scanned the document, pleased to find that I could read medieval Latin. There was a lot of stuff about feudal payments and regulations concerning inheritance for widows and children, and waffle about money and other economic matters. A very important point was that the sale of justice would be forbidden. This was, after all, bribery, and the unpopular taxations of scutage and amercement should cease immediately. Furthermore, debts and tariffs should be regulated, and most importantly, it would not be possible to imprison a free man without trial by his peers. Foreigners could no longer be appointed to important positions over English barons, and indeed all foreign knights and mercenaries should return at once to whence they came. Now, I might only be a small dog, but even I realised the importance of such a document. I knew, with the wisdom of foresight, that it would go on to become the backbone of law in England and have further significance in the world, albeit with quite a lot of revisions over the next few years. The part of the charter that the king really didn't like was the security clause, which gave 25 barons permission to force the king to sign for the community of the realm or face imprisonment. This was serious stuff, giving the barons ultimate power over the king. Reading on, I could see nothing in there about my requested doggy bowls. I would have to do something about that. The scribe went off to find himself some lunch, muttering and shaking his head, knowing that this was not going to be a peaceful agreement, as the king was in no mood to give up any of his assumed power. He didn't ask me if I wanted anything to eat. I saw the abandoned quill lying on the table and seized my chance. I first glanced around to make sure no one was looking, and then I snatched it up and dipped it in the ink. I started to write in my neatest script, copying the styles of the letters. K9. "What do you think you're doing to the Great Charter?" bellowed King John as he snatched the precious document away from me in mid-sentence, smudging the words I'd written with his sleeve. I jumped down and hid once more in the folds of the tablecloth, hopefully out of sight, and trying to stop shaking with fear. The crown rolled onto the floor. I'd missed an opportunity here, and once more it seemed my simple request would go ungranted. The king sat for an hour or so with his head in his hands, gnashing his teeth and complaining loudly about the injustice of the demands that his royal personage would have to give up. When the scribe returned to the negotiating table, followed closely by the rebellious barons, the mood had changed. Amazing what the effect lunch can have in a crisis. and proceedings recommenced slightly more smoothly. The spokesman for the barons explained that King John had no choice, concede or give up the throne and the kingdom of England to France. The scribe nervously pushed the inkpot towards the angry king, not daring to look up nor make eye contact with the disempowered monarch. He felt around desperately for his abandoned writing implement, but it was nowhere to be seen. The scribe lifted the cloth, peered under the table and scowled at me. I was still doing my terrier shake. Luckily, he didn't notice my guilty secret. In the surprise of being discovered red-pawed, amending the charter, I'd taken the quill to my hiding place, and in my panic, I'd snapped it clean in half with my teeth. The scribe feared that a further delay, whilst a fresh quill was brought, might cause King John to retract his already wavering consent. Instead, the scribe roared for sealing wax, and much to the king's surprise, he grabbed the royal hand and thrust the signet ring into the hot red liquid and pushed it down, dripping onto the document, thus affixing the royal seal to the document that became Magna Carta. The king was amazed by the audacity of the scribe, but knew he was cornered and had no choice. What use was a king without a kingdom? The Great Charter had been sealed, and that was good enough to send the barons home muttering amongst themselves, although some would have still liked to have imprisoned the king as threatened. And so you see, Magna Carta, which, after numerous revisions, went on to become the basis of the English justice system and the model of the United States Bill of Rights in 1791, as well as the foundation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, was not actually signed in ink by the belligerent king, as is often depicted in historic paintings. No, it was not signed because a little Jack Russell ran off with the quill whilst trying to add his own clause, or should that be clause, about statutory dog bowls. I ran back through the woodland to the priory, and luckily the gate was still open. I saw the silhouette of the prioress within, and I circled the yew tree, looking for the hole that would lead me to the time tunnel. I was very relieved to see a familiar glow of lanterns and dived headlong into the hole. On the way back, I told Yulia all that had happened, and I asked her why the prioress wouldn't speak to me. She'd probably taken a vow of silence, the woodland girl answered quite simply. I hadn't thought of that. I wasn't used to humans ever being silent. The next night, when it was dark and everyone was in bed, including me, I heard furious tapping on the kitchen window and knew that only meant one thing. Athelstan had sent Yulia and Bubo the owl to summon me for another important task. I wondered where we were off to this time and remembered to take the pink ball with me. I dropped it at the base of the Athelstan tree as I wagged my tail in greeting. "So you nearly scuppered the signing of Magna Carta, did you, little pup?" roared Athelstan, but I could sense by his tone, despite the darkness, that he was smiling. "What happened after the sealing of the charter then, Athelstan? Did the barons go back to their castles and the king start behaving better towards his subjects?" I asked, curious to know the outcome of the story. "Not exactly," said Athelstan, and he went on to explain that the bullying continued, and the following year French Prince Louis invaded the south of England, and King John retreated, leaving the French ruling a third of England, including London, with full baronial support, unheard of in the whole of English history. The Pope declared the charter unlawful. Just a year after the historic charter was harumph sealed, fugitive King John died of dysentery, leaving his young son to rule as Henry III, and it was left to others to drive the French from English shores. It took 2 more kings and various revisions of Magna Carta to make it into the law we still adhere to today. To sum up, everyone, even the King or Queen of England, is subject to the law. He finished his speech with a flourish. So now you know. So thank you so much for listening. to us. Actually, I'm just going to read a little dog blog to you because I've just noticed that the next one is rather a funny one. So this is one of the things I actually witness Rolo doing in his everyday life as a cute dog. So this is dog blog number 6. The smiley lady had been to yoga and was hungry and needed comfort food. I watched her get milk from the fridge door and mix a little with some custard powder and sugar. She poured the rest of the milk into a saucepan to bring it carefully to the boil. Then she mixed in the yellow stuff, and when it had thickened, she carefully poured herself a big bowl of homemade custard over a sliced banana. She set it cooling on the dining room table and went upstairs to get changed as it was piping hot, so hot the steam was rising off it. I quickly glanced around the table and saw a chair leg slightly out. In a trice, I was up on the table and had gulped down the steaming custard and sliced banana, leaving the bowl completely clean, even under the spoon. I'm just going to show you Chantel's drawing. Hopefully you can see that. Rolo and the bowl of custard. Rolo, what are you up to? I heard her coming back downstairs and was afraid she'd heard the telltale chinking of my tag on the underside of the bowl, usually my sign to let her know when my water bowl is empty. I was already lying meekly in my basket, licking my lips to get rid of that delicious but incriminating custard. From the corner of my half-closed eyes, I could see her lifting the spoon and inspecting the bowl and then going back to the hob to see if she had actually poured the custard from the saucepan or if she'd just thought she had. When the smiley lady put 2 and 2 together, she said I could forget any thoughts of supper. I was pretty full anyway. I heard her explaining to the floppy-haired boy when he came home from school, and both tried to hide their laughter as they were pretending to be cross with me. So that's the end of our readings for this week. I hope you've enjoyed tuning in to listen to us. Rolo's actually sat still today, miracle. And I hope you have a lovely weekend, and we will be back on Monday afternoon at 3:30 with another live reading. And I've no idea as yet which book we're going to dip into, but we hope to see you then. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.